Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
Hello, this is Jonathan Ledyard, and together with Mark Gallagher, we're At The Controls, the podcast which thrives on talking to people with a passion for boats, cars or planes with a Formula One thread. David Coulthard and Mike Gascoigne certainly epitomised the energy and enthusiasm that supercharged both of us in life and in episode 1. And we need characters like them even more than ever, because the world is now a mighty different place in April than it was in March when we recorded our first podcast. Sport, business, travel, shopping, education, even just going out of the house have been completely overtaken by the coronavirus or COVID-19. So point 1, Mark and I are clearly not in a studio together. Point 2, we're both fit and well. Aren't we, Mark?
Very well indeed. Where are you broadcasting from, Jonathan?
Study, West London, looking out on a deserted road. We're into week 3, which sometimes can feel like about week 103.
Yeah, it's kind of variously drags, and then I think it also is going quite quickly. I can't believe we've had 2 weeks of lockdown already. I'm broadcasting from rural Oxfordshire. I'm also in my study, which I sometimes call my home office, and my wife now calls Studio A because of the amount of podcasting and interviewing that I seem to have been doing over the last 10 days or a fortnight. My garden has never looked better, I have to say, Jonathan. It's immaculately mowed. It's being mowed about 3 times a week at the moment, doing laps of the lawn and enduring this lockdown, enduring or enjoying, I'm not too sure which, but it seems to sway between the two.
You know, I think that's absolutely spot on. I think those 2 words sum it up. They sound quite similar, and I think for a lot of us, it is exactly that. The enjoyment has certainly come from being involved in this podcast, because another key word I find at the moment in my life is purpose. What is my purpose? What am I trying to do? But this is a purpose to do at the controls, because we've got an opportunity to link up with some fascinating people. Firstly, we've got a pioneering Formula One fan whose interest in the sport has led to many lives being saved around the world because of significant lessons from the pit lane. This is Martin Elliott, Professor of Pediatric Cardiothoracic Surgery. We're also going to be talking to the driving force behind a unique aviation project, the People's Mosquito, which is an aircraft which is set to return to the skies 75 years after it was first built. And our other guest is Charlie Martin, aiming to become the first transgender driver at the Le Mans 24 Hours. She was interviewed by Claire Cottingham, and you may remember in our first edition we talked to Claire about how that interview was and some of the issues which were raised by it. But in terms of our first guest, Mark, this professor of medicine, a man you've known very well, Martin Elliott. Tell us more.
Yes, I got to know Martin through the public speaking circuit. We both presented conferences in different parts of the country and around the world. And in fact, we were subsequently asked to speak together, literally coming on stage one after another, talking about the similarities between the world of healthcare and Formula One. And in Martin's case, of course, an extraordinary individual, as you say, a professor of cardiothoracic surgery. He worked at Great Ormond Street Hospital. And he really first came to my attention because back in the mid-2000s, he famously invited the Ferrari Formula One team to come into Great Ormond Street Hospital and to talk to them about some of the procedures and processes around moving patients from operating theatres into intensive care units. He was very struck, he and his colleagues were very struck by the efficiency of a Formula One pit stop, and they thought we could learn quite a lot for that. So a good 15 years before coronavirus came along and the world of Formula One got involved with the ventilator challenge, developing components to contribute to the UK's shortage of ventilators. Formula One was already involved in healthcare thanks to the efforts of Martin. And not just what a talented individual, but what a very nice man to speak to for the podcast.
So let's hear from Professor Martin Elliott, whose medical skills have seen him teach and operate on hearts and lungs around the world. But the way he and his colleagues worked changed dramatically because of Formula One. So the natural starting point for our conversation was what sparked his contact with F1 through his work in the operating theatre at Great Ormond Street Hospital.
I've spent pretty well all my working career operating on the hearts of babies, which are small, about the size of a walnut, and it's a bit like operating on the inside of a walnut at the bottom of a wine glass. And you can't do that without A, a whole bunch of kit, and B, some incredibly smart people around you. Working in that environment, you suddenly realize how dependent you are on a whole bunch of scientists in the background who've done materials science, for example, or understanding flow dynamics. There's a whole bunch of stuff. And there are enormous parallels in that pursuit of excellence, which we have in order to make our babies safe and well, as there is between a Formula One team in its pursuit of excellence. So there's a combination of engineering, materials, and teamwork for a common goal.
What actually struck you as the similarities between what you did and what you saw on television and eventually when you went to a race, then in between a Formula One team and your medical team?
I need to give you a little bit of history. In the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a big problem in Bristol where a lot of heart babies died. And as part of the inquiry into that, it was commented that the journey from the operating room to the intensive care unit was almost as dangerous as the episode in the operating room and the episode in the intensive care, which intuitively you'd think would be the most dangerous bit. My predecessor at Great Ormond Street, Mark de Laval, did a research study where he observed surgery all over the country for different reasons, but identified that that journey was an equal risk wherever you worked. And we were just had a busy night one Saturday and operating again on the Sunday morning, and the Spanish Grand Prix came on TV. And we saw the incredible organization of a pit stop in those days with a fuel load as well. And McLaren changed the wheels and fueled the car up in 6.8 seconds. And we suddenly realized that if they could do that in such an organized way, why the hell couldn't we get it right? My colleague, Alan Goldman, who is South African and therefore brave, phoned, I hate the telephone, he phoned up McLaren for some bizarre reason, got put through to the pit stop, and the following Tuesday they came to see us and said they could solve this problem by engineering their way out of it by building kit. So that's how we got started. It was just seeing a pit stop and how it worked, the smoothness and the engineering involved.
It was Dave Ryan, who was a McLaren team manager at the time, who came in to Great Ormond Street to talk to you. But then the McLaren relationship, there was an attempt at kind of putting together a formalised project there. That didn't quite work out. And then you ended up at Silverstone and being invited to see the Ferrari pit stop. And that then started a relationship with Ferrari. Explain how that all came about.
I can't actually remember exactly what triggered it, but obviously we hadn't given up on the learning that was available from that. In fact, again, Mark de Laval, Alan Goldman, and a few others, we tried to get research grant to study this further, and Ferrari became very interested. And we went up there to watch it. Great Ormond Street was part of a fundraising episode at the British Grand Prix regularly, so that was another good link. And so we found ourselves there watching excellence at work, and it just again seemed so obvious. And we got some grant money and worked with Ferrari both at Great Ormond Street and Maranello to try and understand what was different between a pit stop as an organizational process and what we were doing in moving a baby from one place to another. So remember, this was just essentially a very simple task of moving a baby on a trolley from one place to another. There's hardware and software and intelligence to be transferred over that period of time. So the baby would have to be disconnected from its stable environment in the operating room, put on a trolley, wheeled down a corridor, reconnected to its monitoring. And then you have to transfer all you've learnt about that baby from one team to another team, both teams of whom would probably rather be in the pub because they had a long day or a long night ahead of them. That kind of behaviour had to be formalised, and we weren't formalised. Neither Dave Ryan nor Nigel Stepney could understand who was in charge. Just by learning all the individual steps of the processes of how a pit stop was organised, the organisational framework of that, when written down, was much more complicated for our journey than it was for a pit stop. And so applying the discipline over the top of that Ferrari were using produced a 4 times reduction in errors. And the processes that we've adopted have now been replicated in pretty well every hospital all over the world.
Had it never struck you that you were, to quote you from one of your lectures, clumsy and informal? And I think maybe Nigel Stepney was even stronger in his language in terms of how can you be like this?
Sounds like my wife talking about me. I think clumsy and informal was a very modest way of remarking. He thought that we were all a bunch of morons, I think. It was right. We were taking our eye off a key part of the game. It's so exhausting doing a long, detailed operation on a tiny baby, as you can imagine, and then you kind of relax, and yet there's one more lap to go.
You're at the epicenter of these operations, and as you said, it takes many hours and it's incredibly intensive. Are you the driver? Are you the Formula One driver in this situation rather than the team leader? You're not the Toto Wolff, you're the Lewis Hamilton. Is that a better analogy?
I think that's a really clever question, because the one thing I can say after doing this for 40 years or so is that leadership in those environments is in a constant state of flux. There are circumstances in which you are genuinely the leader, and that would certainly be the case inside the operating room. But while the child is being made ready for the operating room, it's the anaesthetist who's in charge. And if something were to change during the operation so that the heart-lung machine became a significant player, where something went wrong with that, then the perfusionist would become in charge. And if there were additional problems for a heart rhythm, for example, we would bring in a cardiologist who would then take over that function. So there's a function-based shift in leadership at regular intervals in order to produce the best outcome. In the operating room, you're definitely taking the position of the driver, but the overall practice, the Toto Wolff is head of department who's planning everything for everybody all the time. The best way of describing what we were like before is to talk about the motivation for what we do. And you can see that now in the coronavirus problem, is that people in medicine are just fundamentally trained to help. We rush to help whoever is in trouble. That can get in the way as well as being helpful if you're all going to do each other's job, where actually much more clarity of definition over what job you should do can improve efficiency and safety. And that's what we learned from the pit stop, allocating tasks to the people who were best able to do them and not getting in their way.
Now, let's just talk a little bit about another topic, Martin, that I think is quite close to all our hearts, and that's having the right information available. Formula One is a very data-driven sport, and we've seen Formula One get involved with data analytics at Birmingham Children's Hospital. So McLaren Applied Technologies, and I believe you know some of the folks down there, got involved in a program up at Birmingham Children's Hospital, basically monitoring young patients, real-time monitoring, looking at trends. Is the patient deteriorating? Do we need to adjust things? Because I think, as you've said to me on a few occasions, every patient is different. Very subtle changes in presumably body temperature or pressures or whatever make all the difference. So this kind of data analytics environment is, again, a bridge between the two sectors, healthcare and Formula One.
Well, both our fields are entirely data-driven, actually. So my world is data-driven from imaging, pressures, flow rates and so on, while we're making diagnostic decisions. But in the intensive care unit, you see on the screen a whole bunch of coloured squiggly lines, which are, if you like, the equivalent of the engine traces that you see in the pit wall. And there's not any fundamental difference in using it for us to predict when a baby's going to go off or avoiding a cardiac arrest, for example, in the same way you might search for component failure or falling oil pressure. The idea would be, in the first instance, to spot the baby that's going off and intervene early. But the long-term goal must surely be that the computer obviously doesn't know what's good or bad. You have to tell it that. And it doesn't know what you did to make it better, but it can learn that. And since most of the things that we use to get a baby better involve some other machine interface, like a syringe pump with rates of infusion in it, or a ventilator, many of those characteristics can change. You could imagine in the future that algorithms can be written whereby the monitoring dictates the flow rate or the ventilator adjustment. And this is just such a fantastic idea to me, that you'll be able to do the same thing more efficiently, safely, and gathering data all the time at high quality so that you get better more quickly, just as you do in Formula One.
We're all in agreement that what we have in front of us today in 2020 in terms of technology and the things that you can now do with it is just, only a few years ago, would have been almost science fiction. And from a Formula One perspective, it's transformed everything, not just safety, but quality, reliability. I mean, Lewis Hamilton's car basically doesn't seem to ever fail him these days just because of the security around that. Jonathan, I know you want to bring things up to date with Martin.
Yes, it was a thought about your relationship still with Formula One and Mercedes, and the fact that you've been invited to talk to the Mercedes workforce in recent years by Toto Wolff. And I was fascinated to see what in particular you impressed upon them and what you took away and what they took away, possibly, if that was easy to gauge.
Well, it's easy for me to say what I took away from it. I took away a very strong sense of teamwork, extraordinary engineering ability, and an obsession with success. The second thing I came away with was an awareness that many of the people in that team were just as fascinated and, in a way, motivated by what we were doing with small babies as we were watching cars go around the track at high speed. You know, the admiration we felt for the Mercedes team and for all the sort of precision that goes into that and the massive preparation and rates of change to deliver a new component were matched, I think, by the ideas about how on earth can you operate on somebody's baby and, you know, inside their heart, it's all so tiny. How do you do that? How do you know what's wrong with it? There are about 3,500 things that can be wrong with your heart when you're born and 2,500 things you could do to fix it. It is an extraordinarily complex retinue of stuff you have to put together in your head because you can't do it on your own. It has to be a group of people to maintain that level of knowledge, exactly as it does in Formula One. So we saw lots of parallels. The difference is essentially that ours is organic work. In other words, the body fixes itself. And yours is mechanical work, engineering work, where it doesn't do that. You have to fix it for the body with absolute precision. We've got a bit more leeway than you have.
Would it be valid for Formula One to try and continue to play a bigger role in maybe supporting the healthcare sector or even perhaps just research within the healthcare sector just because the fit seems to be so good?
Well, for me, that's a no-brainer. I think that the relationship between the two sets of individuals has been incredibly productive and is probably likely to continue to be so. The creativity that you see behind the scenes in Formula One and its ability to react quickly is something that needs to be released from those people who work in healthcare, who, for obvious reasons, have a deeply regulatory framework. But then so do you. And within those tight regulations, you have the opportunity to be really creative. It seems to me that the message to come out of this is that there's something between competition and collaboration which needs to be explored more philosophically almost, because working together across industries is something I've got very interested in over the last few years, been asked to talk about quite a lot. It's not just Formula One. We've worked with the airline industry, the hotel industry to try and pick best practice. It seems to me that needs to do better. There are whole areas of industry which don't talk to each other, and competition is used as an excuse. But actually, collaboration makes things work faster in the end because the skills overlap so much. What we need to do is to find a way of doing that doesn't kill either industry or kill each other's group, motivations. What I observed at Mercedes is right, that they're as excited by what we do as we are by what you do, then there must be fertile ground for innovation. Just if I take one example of the flow dynamics of aerodynamic design that you've used to make all your cars faster, that's exactly the same as us designing new operations. The maths are the same, some of the people involved are the same, and those borderlands between your discipline and my discipline are fertile ground, and I'm sure there'll be many, many more after this event.
And I think that was a really strong point for Martin Elliott to finish on, talking about the future for Formula One's collaboration and assistance for the healthcare environment. And of course, it's all extremely topical at the moment, which is why we invited Martin onto At the Controls, because the ventilator challenge, which 7 of the Formula One teams based here in the UK have been contributing to, has been getting lots of coverage. And I think people have been very excited to hear that Formula One teams have been using their engineering prowess to contribute to the manufacturing of components, which are going to be used in manufacturing and assembling ventilators, which are much needed, of course, by the National Health Service. Then, of course, a huge amount of coverage for a separate project, which the Mercedes-Benz High Performance Powertrain Division in Brixworth in Northampton have been working on with UCL in London, and that's to create a CPAP. That's a continuous pressure breathing aid, providing air for a patient. It's not as invasive as a ventilator. It's literally a mask that you just put over your face. But that's been a great project, which, again, has had a lot of pickup and a lot of interest from people around the world. So the collaboration has already been there from Formula One in the middle of this crisis. And, of course, it's not just being confined to engineering and technology being deployed. It's also about people. And of course, there's been a great story, Jonathan, about Ron Dennis coming to the table with an amazing project to provide 1 million meals to NHS workers. Now, you've met Ron on many an occasion.
Yep, like you. I mean, a man who to some people can be very divisive, Marmite. I always got on pretty well with him, I've got to say. And you know the one thing about him, whether you liked him or respected him or found it difficult to find a way to get on with him, if he put his mind to something, he did it 100%. He epitomized almost the Formula One environment. Don't you think that this can-do positivity? It's like an engineer said to me this week. People just get on with things, set them a task, and they're away. They're trying to make it work as quickly as possible. And typically Ron Dennis, when he put his mind to it, it wasn't just a question to ring up a few people, say, we'll buy you a few meals. No, this was a proper Ron Dennis project. Everything was thought through, everything was analysed, and everything was made to work absolutely spot on. This is the man, of course, who famously had the gravel turned at the MTC, the McLaren Formula One headquarters. I mean, this is a man who, with attention to detail, second to none. And he has made sure that what he's put his mind into, what he's put his money to, absolutely works like clockwork, like a machine.
Do you remember when Ron got the garage at Silverstone tiled? Actually completely tiled. Yeah. And actually the
marble floor.
Exactly. And the following year, we had finished in that place in the World Championship. So we got that garage at Jordan. It was quite hilarious. So we had this beautiful, amazing floor in the garage for the British Grand Prix. But Ron Dennis, we have to say a round of applause to him. Obviously, much wider stories, of course, now in Formula One about the effect of coronavirus on the sport. And, Jonathan, it's ground to a halt, hasn't it?
Are we actually going to see Formula One in 2020? You'd listen to someone we talked about Ron Dennis, you talked to another great of Formula One, Bernie Ecclestone. And he's been on the record saying he would probably scrap 2020 and look forward to making sure you had a proper viable championship ready to go in 2021. I mean, you need 8 races to have a world championship, but given the current state of play, and I know we're only in April and it's wrong to speculate possibly that what may happen in September, October, however much the world is looking for positivity, yes, Formula One needs to be ready to go, but is there really going to be the environment that can allow for a multinational, international sport which crosses national boundaries? It's all real having a race, say, for example, in Great Britain or in Spain or in Germany, but are you going to have a whole circus of people, 3,000, 4,000 people, which make Formula One tick? Are you going to have them crossing boundaries and flying around the world to America, Brazil, Japan, and so on? I wonder, I have to say.
I think this is the big question, is the harmonising of borders so that you can move seamlessly from one part of the world to another, which we used to take so for granted, and now it seems very remote from our day-to-day reality under lockdown. And I think we're seeing the profound effect of coronavirus in Formula One now, while we're recording at the controls, with the news that Formula One teams are laying off staff or furloughing staff. McLaren were the first to go public with that. Williams have now accepted that they've had to follow that procedure. I think it's very noticeable too that Formula One Group, so that's the head office of Formula One, the commercial rights holder, they have furloughed half of their staff. Their senior personnel have taken a 20% pay cut, and the chief executive of Formula One, Chase Carey, has taken a further pay cut in addition to that. It shows that across the sport, not just the teams, not just the suppliers, but Formula One Group itself, having to tighten its belt, conserve cash, avoid spending money at a time when, frankly, no one knows when this sport is going to return to the stage. And may well be that 2020 goes down in history for all kinds of reasons, but from a Formula One point of view, for the fact that there's actually no Formula One World Championship whatsoever this season.
That's Mark Gallagher, and I'm Jonathan Ledyard, and you're listening to At the Controls, a podcast which is trying to inspire you and lift your spirits. And we're going to focus now on an aviation project which I hope will stir the hearts of not just those who love flying, because the aeroplane we're talking about played a role just as important as the Spitfire or any of the warbird bombers of the Second World War. And again, Mark, there's a strong F1 link to this project, isn't there?
Yes, and the link is composite technology, because the Mosquito twin-engine fighter bomber was made from composites, not composite carbon fibre, as in the case of Formula One today, but composite wood technology. And I met John Lilly, chairman and managing director of the People's Mosquito, which is a UK charity which is trying to raise the funds necessary to restore one of these amazing wooden wonders, as the Mosquito is known, and bring it back into the skies over the UK.
It was designed in the dark days of 1940 during the Battle of Britain, initially as a twin-engined, light, unarmed bomber using the very famous Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, which has become an absolute iconic piece of British engineering. And it was made out of wood, which was very much against the mantra of the day, which was aluminium, monocoque, aeroplanes. And this technology was basically going back a generation to World War I techniques. However, it wasn't, because it was using new construction methods, which I know you want to ask me about, composite construction methods, which is very different. For me personally, it was the world's first multi-role combat aircraft. The Mosquito did it first. It was able not only to become a light bomber, but fighter bomber, reconnaissance. There were even sea mosquitoes. Britain's greatest pilot, Captain Eric Winkle-Brown, sadly not with us, ex-Royal Navy, he said it was probably the most important aircraft that helped win the war for the Royal Air Force because of its multi-role combat capability. So for me, that's missing in our heritage today. The engineering is fantastic. There's a lot from that aeroplane, we can inspire the future from. And from that, we have three pillars to the project, which are very personal to me. One of my pillars is to remember, and I want to remember all the men and women that contributed to World War II. What a generation it was, wow. Secondly, we want to educate people in terms of our legacy, our history, but also inspire the future. And the third area is to fly it. I don't believe things should sit in museums. That's why I want to do it. People need to see living history. And I know some of your listeners have got historic Formula One cars or historic sports cars, and I'm sure they'd agree with me. They're much better out there on the track, aren't they?
No question about it. Now, you just mentioned in passing, powered by the Merlin engine. I think a lot of people would know about that famous engine powering Spitfires in the Second World War. But of course, the Mosquito had two of them, and she had a very light aircraft, very powerful aircraft. And you mentioned also about the construction. Of course, in motor racing, engineering terms, composite technology has been around for some time, and we kind of take it for granted. People talk about composite carbon fiber aluminium tubs, all that kind of stuff. The reality is that in terms of composite technology in aviation, the Mosquito was, I believe, the first combat aircraft to feature a composite structure. And as you said, it was made from wood. So it was quite groundbreaking, wasn't it?
It was groundbreaking. And, at the time, from design to flying was 1 year. That is tremendously fast in aircraft prototyping.
It sounds like Formula One timeframes, actually.
Exactly. I mean, they had inspiration. World War II was on. We have a great treasure trove of 22,300 drawings, and my favourite one is a piece of 4x2 timber dated December 26th, Boxing Day 1940. They weren't celebrating Christmas, they were getting on with the design, So the aircraft first flew in October 1941. So that shows you, you're right, Formula One speeds of development. And, people thought they'd gone back to World War I using wood. But actually, when you look at the way the fuselage is made, then you understand the breakthrough. Basically, they constructed a mould. So if you can imagine a mould of the Mosquito fuselage, it's like an oval shape. But then they took layers of ply, layers of 1-ply, 2-ply, single-ply, and balsa. Basically, they had a load of ply on a base and made it flexible so it could curve into the shape. Then they would put a sandwich of some balsa in some sections and then more ply and put glue in between, building up a composite structure. And I believe, Mark, you're much more experienced and technical than myself on Formula One cars, but I guess building up, composite material on modern materials is a similar way, I think.
Exactly. I mean, you go into Formula One, you go into Mercedes-Benz or the Red Bull Racing composites departments today, you'll see exactly that procedure going on, albeit with modern materials, carbon fiber technology being as it is, but again, layering the composite up and, of course, bonding it in the right way. And I find it interesting, John, that you're not building this plane as a new build aircraft. You're effectively restoring an aircraft that existed, and that was a Mosquito which went by the name RL-249.
Yeah.
Tell us about that aircraft, and then perhaps tell us, why do you go down the path of sourcing parts from I believe, a crashed aircraft, and using that as the base for a restoration? What is behind that process?
Yeah, RL-249, it's his RAF in-service serial number. It was a post-war Mosquito. It was what we call an NF-36, or a night fighter, another successful development of the Mosquito. And the night fighters were in use well until the early 1950s, because the jet age hadn't caught up with night fighting until then. Our particular aircraft was based at RAF Coltishall in Norfolk. Fortunately, during a training sortie at night, it had a sort of twin-engine failure with a development of the Merlin, a 113, 114A engine, which by that stage was a two-speed, two-stage, sort of, for you guys out there understanding engines, you have different superchargers for different altitudes to give it power, speed and climb rate. However, there was a technical issue which caused both to fail on takeoff, and it crashed in some woods not far from the base. Thankfully, the pilot was okay, but his sort of navigator, airborne intercept officer, was badly injured, and the pilot went back a bit akin, if you've watched the 633 Squadron movie, to chopping his way in and pulling his colleague out, and he sadly passed away. But his colleague got the George Cross for that. The aircraft was put out, smallish fire, but generally okay. Recovered back to the air base, and they decided it was, not repairable. And they stripped it for spares, and it was used as what we call an instructional airframe for guys serving on the squadron. When RF Coltishall's runway was extended for the jet age, they reduced the perimeter of the wartime airfield, and this plane was sat there. So in good old traditional fashion of disposables, a large hole was dug and she was set fire and put into a big hole. And then many years later, in the early 2000s, a recovery group found it and dug up what the remains were. We purchased that aircraft several years ago, or the remains of, which someone says, well, how much have you got left? If I can say to you it's about the akin of filling a standard transit van up with bits, then there's not much. But that comes on to your next question. Why do you take such remains and you can rebuild? The Civil Aviation Authority, or CAA as we'll say now, are very clear on this subject. If you've got the mortal remains of an aircraft, you can remanufacture. That's the word we use, because at the end of the day, we're remanufacturing parts to the original OEM, or original engineering manufacturer's design. And the CAA regulations allow you to remanufacture to the original OEM based on an original registered aeroplane. And by using the original parts and the original serial number, you can then rebuild that aircraft. Now, if you then didn't have an original aircraft, and you started from scratch with nothing, not even an original aeroplane, then unfortunately that would be classed as a new build. And that means then you're going to have to do prototype testing of every single part, component, and crashing something, and suddenly the cost becomes 100-fold, Mark.
Now, where on earth do you go to find someone who can build you a 1940s twin-engine Mosquito fighter bomber?
Well, I'm pleased to say there are many companies worldwide, and the UK has many, many of the best of aircraft restoration companies. One of those, the supplier we've chosen, is a company called Retrotech, who are based down in East Sussex. And Retrotech have got 30, 35 plus year history of rebuilding Spitfires, Hurricanes, Hawker Furies, and so on, 1930s and 1940s aircraft. They've been able to obtain old machinery, old tooling, drawings, specifications, and what they will do is remanufacture to the original engineering specifications. And there are companies out there who are also remanufacturing new parts and processes as well.
So tell me this. Okay, so we've got Retrotech doing the airframe and the wings and all of that amazing structure. Being someone from the world of motorsport, of course, the power plant is always extremely important. Powertrain technology is kind of been the big thing in Formula One in recent years, of course, with our hybrid engines that we've got these days. How do you source the engines for a Mosquito? Presumably there isn't a production line somewhere producing Merlin engines, but so tell us about the engines that will be powering your aircraft when it's back in the sky and where you are sourcing them from.
Yeah. Again, thankfully, there's a very active global, what we call warbird scene. Mustangs, Spitfires, Hurricanes, all using a Merlin design. Yes, there's not one in every town or city. You can't go and pick an engine off a shelf. However, there are still engine blocks and people flying aircraft, all over the world. There are several specialists. There's one or two in the United States. There's one or two in the United Kingdom that are still, able to manufacture spares and parts. And something like the engine blocks are rarer, not in production. But there are specialist companies out there restoring aircraft engines.
Do you mind if we bother you again later this year for an update?
No, absolutely. And I think we should reconvene down at Retrotech, and you can see for yourself, how the mold's been made, where they approach building the aeroplanes. Very impressive.
And that's an invitation we're surely going to take up, isn't it, Mark, to go to Retrotech in Hastings? We shall be there whenever this lockdown eventually lifts.
Yeah, there'll be a nice drive in the countryside when it happens. Now, for anyone listening who would like to follow the People's Mosquito or actually to join the club, because you can actually subscribe and help them with the funding, you can find them online. They have a website, www.peoplesmosquito.org.uk. You can also check out the People's Mosquito on Twitter and on Instagram. And actually, if you want to have a look at a Mosquito flying today, if you go on YouTube and you look for a Mosquito aircraft, there is one currently flying in Canada that has been restored in Canada, also one in New Zealand. So John Lilly's wonderful project to bring one back to the skies of Europe and over the UK in particular is going to be a terrific one.
And we shall follow that project, as you say, Mark. Now, we talked about our third guest in episode 1 with Claire Cottingham, her interview with Charlie Martin, who's set her heart on becoming the first transgender driver at the Le Mans 24-hour race. It's an extraordinary listen, very honest, a very emotional interview, because Charlie's had to overcome great personal fears, great personal challenges on the way to realising her dream to become a top-flight driver.
Motorsport really was something that was kind of unplanned. No one in my family's ever raced or anything. I mean, I wanted to be a fighter pilot. That was my earliest ambition. Probably because I was born in the 80s and Top Gun came out. But I don't know. There's something about, flying and fast jets and the speed and the kind of glamour of it that really ticked all the boxes for me growing up. And then I kind of gave up on that dream because I'm pretty bad at maths, to put it lightly, and kind of gave up on that. And simultaneously, one of my school friends had a dad who raced. And so going away with them at the weekends and camping and just being involved in that sort of side of everything that's happening was really my introduction to motorsport. But even back then, I never thought, I could be a racing driver. It was just something that I liked being in that environment and seeing it all happen. I always thought this was something that other people did.
What year was it then when you were introduced to motorsport?
I mean, the first time I went, I was probably about 9 or 10 years old. So it was my friend Hamish, who still races now. He's a very good driver. He races a Morgan three-wheeler, as did his dad. Because I used to do hill climbs and circuit racing as well and all kinds of things. So I got to see quite a lot of different sides to motorsport. And that's really why I started off hill climbing, because, all those different types of motorsport that I'd seen, I kind of felt like the hill climb paddock was quite a chilled out place. And coming from the point of view of, not really having like a dad, I lost my dad when I was quite young to cancer. So I was like, I didn't have that sort of traditional thing of, like a dad who was like, we'll work on the engine and we'll kind of, everything I learned going into motorsport, I kind of just learned on the job really. So I just kind of threw myself into it. And so, hill climb seemed like a nice place to start because it was really, it was really friendly, and it was competitive driving, but it was just, you didn't have that added element of potentially crashing into people all the time, and things that I just didn't have a clue how to repair those.
Yeah, and it was during the time, wasn't it, in the hill climb paddock when your world really changed?
It was always the elephant in the room for me in terms of how I felt about who I am and how I fit into the world around me. Because even from a really, really young age, I guess 6, 7 years old, something like that, I knew that I wanted to be a girl, or that I felt that I was a girl, or, for whatever reason, that's how I felt on the inside. And I mean, I think it's important to give some kind of context as well, because when I was growing up, there was no internet, there was no YouTube. These days, transgender people are fairly frequent occurrence in terms of conversations going on the media and programs. And I think it's great that we're in a point in time where these things are being discussed, and that ultimately people have a chance to actually understand what it means to be transgender and what people go through. And I think ultimately that's important, because that's really what creates more empathy, and that's what drives change in society. But back then there was none of that. And so the only times that I ever had any kind of window into what it means to be transgender was I don't know, through something like the Jerry Springer show, or basically some instance of a trans person being presented as some kind of oddity, someone who has something wrong with them, someone who lives on the fringes of society, and ultimately just presented as a really negative thing. And so to grow up feeling your whole life like people like you have something wrong with you, and feeling ashamed, and ultimately feeling like you have something that no one is going to really understand, and that you have to hide that from the world. And so, I went through my whole childhood really feeling like that. And that's incredibly damaging, I think, to live with that to live with that, and then to ultimately reach a point where you're like, well, okay, the world is changing, and I'm just going to take a step into the kind of unknown, really, and a step into the kind of void, and just because I have to do this to carry on living as the person that I want to be.
What were the most common misconceptions that you might still get now, but that you also had during that period of transition?
There are still some people who think that people choose to be trans. I've even heard people say, oh, it's like kids doing things because they think it's cool, because if people talk about this and they suddenly think that it's like a fad or something at school. I mean, there's all kinds of things like that. I mean, nobody in their sound mind would choose to be trans because it's going to be a fun thing to go through transition, because it's incredibly hard. It's it's really, really tough, and I feel like I've been very lucky. I've had amazing support from my family and from my friends, and in motorsport, in my career. But even so, it's been incredibly tough, and I know so many people who've had things so much harder than I've had to deal with. Like when I went to my GP to go for basically, go to my GP and say, look, I'm transgender. I've known this my whole life, and I want to see a gender clinic, which is who they refer you to start having treatment. I had to wait something like 3 or 4 months. Now, in the context of my lifetime, 3 or 4 months felt like a long time, but it was 3 or 4 months because of problems with the NHS, because of cutbacks and just a lack of staff and training. Now somebody going to their GP is told to wait anything from 2 to 3 years to see a gender clinic. Can you imagine going to your GP and being told that? If somebody went to their GP and said, I've got depression, I feel suicidal, which quite frankly, a lot of people might well do as well as a secondary issue in those circumstances, to then be told, well, sorry, come back in 2 or 3 years.
Did you have to overcome those sorts of feelings?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I'll be honest. I was in a very dark place coming into transition. I was depressed. I was having a breakdown, and I was actually suicidal. I just couldn't see a way that, even though I wanted this more than anything, I just couldn't see a way that it was all going to be okay. I couldn't see a way where my friendships, my relationships with the people that I care about in my life wouldn't somehow be damaged, and that people would still support me and people would still want to be my friend. It makes me feel quite emotional actually just saying that now, because I just think that's so, to me now saying this, it seems bizarre that I would ever think that. But then, because knowing how things have gone and how actually it's been the best thing that I've ever done, how I could have been in a state of mind that I would have felt so hopeless that I would even consider something like that. And yet that's the reality of the situation that I found myself in. And again, a lot of people go through that same process before they reach a point that they say, well, actually, there's only one way forwards, and that's that I have to take this, have to take this brave step into the unknown.
And just on that point, if people are feeling that way or a family member feels that way about someone else, there are charities and things supporting those sorts of emotions, aren't there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so one of the charities that I'm very proud to work with as a patron is Mermaids, who do incredible work to support and empower the lives of transgender children and also their parents, and to really support them through that process, to offer guidance. And so, yeah, if there's anybody who's who knows someone who's going through that process or having those feelings themselves, then as a young person or as a parent of a young person, then Mermaids definitely can really help.
So since your transition and throughout your transition, you've been competing in motorsport. Recently, you were in the Ginetta GT5s. You also did Le Mans Cup. And through that, you've picked up 16,000 followers on YouTube, just watching your journey. Has it been interesting watching people within the motorsport world sort of approach who you are? Because it is a very masculine world. Yes, there's W Series and there's been female teams at Le Mans, but we're seeing changes in motorsport. But back in 2012, when you started your journey, what was that like?
I mean, again, it was a really scary process. There was no one I could look to and think, oh, well, this person's really, I spoke to Danny Watts when he came out, and I have huge respect for him. And obviously, on the one hand, what he achieved in his career, winning class twice at Le Mans, which is my dream to try and emulate something like that. But also, for coming out as a gay man in motorsport. But I think in terms of being transgender, when you transition, you feel very vulnerable, I think. And certainly in the first year or so of transition, when, I'd never lived as a woman before in my life. So it was a very, it's quite a crazy process to just throw yourself into. There's no field manual, that's, to me, that was YouTube, watching people vlog. So I think to come out of motorsport, there was no one I could really look to and say, yeah, okay, that person came out and that was the reaction. I mean, because I've been competing as a woman, as me, for some years prior to that point, and I've been racing. I mean, I raced over in France for 3 years. And after the first year, I came out to all the people that I raced with. It was a really amazing process because the people that I'd met over there were just, I made a lot of friends my first year in France, and people just took me as they found me because they didn't know any of my history. They had no previous sort of idea of who I was. But to them, it was great because I came over, I spoke French, I love France, I loved racing over there. And I was just really, really excited to be doing something where people just accepted me. I just felt like I was so happy for those 3 years because I was just living really authentically as my true self. So when I came out to everybody and they were just like, oh, we were a bit surprised, but it doesn't matter. I was like, oh, wow, actually, well, why should it matter? I'd gone through my whole life thinking being transgender was a negative thing. And I suddenly, for the first time, I had this real tilt shift. And I started to think, well, actually, it's kind of a positive thing, because if I hadn't transitioned, I'd never have had the courage to just come over here in a single seater in a van and just race in a foreign country on my own. So it kind of helped me see that, that people might be accepting. But in 2018, nobody really knew anything about me in UK motorsport. I didn't have a profile over here. And, the motorsport community is just that. It's like one massive family. I think anyone who belongs to that family, who's a part of it, it's just such a great feeling. And, however you identify, it's like that's the thing that brings us all together, that we all share that passion. No one should ever feel a barrier to being a part of that. And no one should ever feel a barrier to being their true, authentic self. I know the massive difference it's made to my performance as a driver on so many levels since I just came out as me and started living as the real me. And people should be free to live as their true selves authentically and feel that they feel welcome, they feel supported in their sport.
Well, I thought that was an extraordinary interview. Well done to Claire Cottingham and to Charlie Martin for giving us that insight. And listening to it, I was really struck by the fact that, becoming a professional racing driver is tough enough at the best of times. And then when you look at the problems that some people face from a diversity problem, it is a sport which in Europe remains predominantly male-dominated, predominantly white-dominated. Lewis Hamilton talked about his battle against racism, for example. But I think Charlie's story is definitely a story for our times, where she's undergone this huge challenge in her life and come out the other side and enjoying her life as a professional racing driver. And quite frankly, it's a story of dealing with the greatest imaginable personal adversity. Really quite inspirational, Jonathan.
It is an extraordinary story. And of course, it's even tougher now for her and anyone trying to make a living, not just in motorsport, but in any form of sport, because of where we are with coronavirus and the uncertainty about where the sport is going to return, where the money is, where the sponsorship is. So your thoughts, my thoughts, our hearts go out to all those trying to make a living, because it's a very, very challenging period. But we should end on a high note, because I think one of the quotes of the last 7 days or so has come from Bernie Ecclestone. I meant to mention this earlier when we mentioned him discussing Formula One and where he would take it. He's 89 and he's going to become a father again. And his quote to the BBC on 5 Live was, "That's what happens when you retire." Is it, Bernie? Really? Aged 89?
I think it's amazing, isn't it? I had a quick look online, and there's a website called oldest.org, which lists records about all the oldest things and people and animals in the world. Turns out Bernie Ecclestone will be the 5th oldest father in recorded history. I don't quite believe that statistic, but anyway, he's right up there in the top 5. Bernie definitely still creating headlines for all kinds of reasons, huh?
Yeah, well, he has been an extraordinary driving force for Formula One and continues to make headlines whenever he opens his mouth, really. There are those who said he should disappear, but he's always good value and always still very much cares about the sport. Right, Mark, that's about it. I think you need to vacate Studio A, go and enjoy some sunshine, do some more laps of the lawnmower. We'll look forward to planning episode 3. Stay safe, stay home, and above all, #be kind.